Welcome to another edition of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm Don Grothoff. Along with my wife Gina, we have a practice called Focused Healthy Family, helping families get past the behavior and anxiety issues naturally. We also produce the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, where we are advocates for our own family and others dealing with OCD and anxiety. In the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, we do interviews, provide resources, and information for treatment and support of OCD recovery. We also want to hear from you, your comments, and if you want to tell your story, we want to put it up on the podcast on our Stories from the OCD side. Our goal in these podcasts is to raise awareness of and advocate for the recovery from obsessive compulsive disorder, better known as OCD. Now, before we get to that podcast, let's hear about our sponsor.
Today I'm here to talk about Q Science's sleep spray. Q Sciences has a number of different sprays. There's a melatonin sleep spray that contains melatonin, 5-HTP, and L-theanine. We've used other melatonin products to help our children with falling asleep. Melatonin is something that occurs naturally in our body that helps us quiet and calm down for sleep. And yet I really feel like I've seen a difference in the spray versus other products. Our youngest is here to talk about it. What things did you like better about the spray versus the other things?
I don't like the chew tablets because they leave like a weird taste, and they're mainly like they also have like you get bits in your teeth.
Okay, so Q Science's spray.
It's a lot better, I'd say. The taste is pretty decent and it works well.
Okay. I'm happy with the quality of these products and how they're helping our whole family. If you'd like to learn more,
simply go to qsciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com. That's the letter Q, sciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com, or visit invisiblewheelchair.com and find out more information there.
There are a lot of supplement products out there, yet you want one that's of good quality. Check out Q Sciences for your family.
Now, let's get to that podcast. Welcome again to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. We're doing a special this week for OCD Awareness Week, which is going on this week. And coming off of the conference they had this past weekend, of course, we talked about on Monday the ERP, which was talked about. That was the topic in many of the little workshops they did on that conference. The other one they talked about was ACT, Acceptance Commitment Therapy. And so I went back into the archives, and in 2020, summer of 2020, I interviewed Jill Stoddard, and she talked about ACT, and I thought I'd bring it back here because, like I said, it was a big topic for the weekend OCD conference, and I wanted to find some information on ACT that I had done from the past. And so what you're going to hear now is a repeat of a podcast I did in 2020 with Jill Stoddard talking about acceptance commitment therapy. Let's go to that podcast now. So Jill, I want to welcome you to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm really glad you're here.
Hi, Don. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So what I like to do initially is to just give a little personal feel of the person I'm interviewing, to give my audience a little connection to you. Is there some story or something that you'd like to share with us about yourself?
Sure. Well, so you've heard my bio, which I think says that I'm from San Diego or live in San Diego, but I'm originally from Boston and have the sailor's mouth to go with it, but I will try to refrain from doing any cursing on the podcast. I have 2 little kids. I have an 8-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son, and 2 French bulldogs named Chips and Biggie, who you might hear barking in the background a little bit today. I bring that up because a lot of what we'll be talking about today is acceptance and commitment therapy, and my book Be Mighty. And I talk a lot about how to find small moments of joy, which I think is particularly relevant right now, where at the time of this recording, we're living in this pandemic and shelter in place orders. And it can sometimes feel hard, I think,
A little.
to find those moments of joy. And so the ones that I have the most are probably with my two crazy, clowny French bulldogs and with my kids. Had a very fun water balloon fight yesterday. And so that's what brings me joy.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. That's a neat story. I have kids myself, and I know that they can bring such joy and be kind of annoying at times too. But
Absolutely.
in your book, Be Mighty, which is a wonderful book, I've had a chance to read. I haven't got all the way through it yet. Just been too busy, but got more than halfway through it and just found all very powerful and anxious to finish reading it. But in it, you mention a difference between stress and anxiety, which I had never thought about. And I'm just going to ask you to maybe define that and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question because you do often hear stress and anxiety used interchangeably. And truthfully, I even use the terms interchangeably sometimes because I think for people to, in some ways, the word doesn't really matter, right? Like we just use a word to try to label a person's specific experience. And if to you what you're experiencing feels like stress, then you can call it stress. If what you feel feels like anxiety, you can call it anxiety. But they are, they share some overlap, but they are somewhat different. And where they overlap mostly is in some of the shared physical symptoms, maybe some muscle tension or chest pain or GI distress. Where they differ is kind of in their longevity. So we think of stress as being a reaction to a specific stressor that we would expect to resolve when that stressor is no longer present. Whereas anxiety is something that even when that stressor is no longer present, the anxiety will likely find something else to latch onto. So one example might be, and I think I use this example in the book, everyone knows moving can be very stressful. You may have a lot of stress about packing and scheduling a mover or doing your own move and getting your friends to help, just coordinating the whole thing. When you're all moved in and you're unpacked, you're not going to be stressed anymore. Whereas someone who struggles more with anxiety may now go on to worry about whether they should have moved in the first place, or if they have kids, is the school system going to be right for their children? Is the street too busy that they're living on? It will kind of find something else to latch on to.
Had not thought about it that way, and I think it's neat to have that differentiation there. And what I found interesting as I read the book, you also mentioned the three amigos of anxiety. I found it interesting, and I thought I'd like you to just talk a little bit about that too, if you could.
Yeah. All right. And they're not really amigos, I suppose. Part of the point of the book is one of the points of the book is no longer treating anxiety as if it's an enemy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be your friend. But what I talk about in there are these three factors that really tend to fuel people's anxiety and make it worse. And it's a really relevant question right now because I imagine your listeners will all be able to relate to these three amigos based on what we're all enduring. And the first is difficulty tolerating uncertainty or ambiguity. So humans in general don't particularly like uncertainty. And in fact, we are evolutionarily programmed to avoid uncertainty. So if you think about, a cave person comes out of their cave looking for breakfast and they see a vague figure up in the distance, maybe it's foggy, they're not really sure what the figure is, there's uncertainty there, it's ambiguous. If that cave person just, marches headlong into that uncertainty and it turns out to be a prehistoric killer kangaroo, then they're going to end up being eaten, right? And so having some healthy respect for uncertainty, avoiding uncertainty, even attempting to resolve the uncertainty to try to figure out, the patterns of the animals that lay the eggs for breakfast versus those that are predators will create a survival advantage. Right? So we're programmed, we're designed to dislike and avoid uncertainty. And typically we have a lot of practice learning how to tolerate it, except that all of that changed when technology came along. So if you think about regular old life now, if you want the answer to any question whatsoever, you immediately have the answer at your fingertips. You can ask Alexa or Siri, there's a million ways, Google it. If you have access to technology, you can have an answer in seconds. If you want to try a new restaurant or buy a new product, Nobody does this blindly and just kind of takes their chance to see how it goes. They look up Amazon reviews, they look up Yelp reviews. And so our like muscles for tolerating uncertainty have atrophied as technology has created less and less practice. We're designed to have uncertainty. We're designed to avoid uncertainty, but generally we get a decent amount of practice tolerating it, but that has really changed in recent years. And so now we have these greater levels, and we know that uncertainty is one of the things that can really fuel anxiety, and especially if you have lesser ability to tolerate it. If you're more if you have an intolerance, it's called intolerance of uncertainty in psychology. So that's the first one. And of course, there's a lot of that right now with this pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty. The other one is a difficulty with a lack of perceived control. And what's interesting about that is that how much control you actually have does not dictate the anxiety. It's how much control you think you have, your perception of control. So if you have no control, but you think you have control, then it's not going to make you more anxious. But if you have a perception that you don't have control, then that tends to fuel anxiety as well. And you see good examples of this, I think, if you think about having like the last time you had a vague medical symptom, maybe you've been more tired lately, maybe you've started to get some headaches, there's some uncertainty because you don't really know exactly what's wrong and what's going on. And you can feel a sort of sense of a lack of control. And so what do people do? They go to the internet, right? They Google it, they go to WebMD. And in that moment, you get a sense of control because I'm doing something to get on top of this thing. And maybe I'm going to reduce my uncertainty because I'm about to find the answers. And so it kind of helps in the short term. But of course, then WebMD is now telling you have a brain tumor or leukemia, and now you have much of a lowered sense of a perception of control, greater uncertainty, and therefore more anxiety. And then the third is an overinflated sense of responsibility. So this idea that it's all on me, I'm responsible, and parents certainly feel this way. People may feel this way in their jobs or at school. And so those three things, any of those things in isolation can create more anxiety. Certainly those three together can really fuel an anxious response. And as I said, you can see how all of those things are really quite present in the current situation in which we're living.
Well, that's great, and I definitely want to stay away from the killer kangaroos. Is there such things? I had not. There is. Okay. Well, so back to the serious side here. I know that in your bio it talks about you being an ACT trainer, and ACT, of course, is the acceptance commitment therapy, which I find fascinating and I think very important, especially in the cases of what I'm dealing with myself and with my family with the OCD and anxiety itself. If you would, maybe talk a little bit about what is ACT or acceptance commitment therapy. Give us some examples of how you used it for anxiety, for OCD if possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So ACT is, at its root, it has one goal, and the overarching goal is to increase psychological flexibility. And it sounds like a lot of syllables in a word, but it's a simple definition. It really just means our ability to show up to this present moment fully and without defense. So with all of our thoughts, all of our emotions, all of our physiological feelings, urges, to be open and aware and not do anything to try to fix or change or control them. And then make conscious, deliberate, mindful choices about what we're going to do or not do. So what kind of behavior will we choose? Will we choose to persist in a behavior that is helpful or what we would refer to as workable in ACT? And I live ACT in my own personal life. My mission is to try to tell as many people as possible about it. And I do that in individual therapy, but it's one of the reasons that I really like doing podcast interviews and why I wrote my book and I have a blog, because I recognize not everyone is going to walk through the door of a therapist's office. And I think it's such an incredibly powerful treatment that I hope that as many people as possible can learn about it. And there are a number of resources out there for people to learn more about it. And so the way that, ACT, one of the things that's great about ACT is it's a trans-diagnostic treatment. Whatever someone is struggling with, whether they want to quit smoking, whether they have OCD, whether they have a different kind of anxiety problem, whether they're going through a breakup or having interpersonal issues, all of these things can and are targeted in acceptance and commitment therapy. Because a big part of what we're looking at is when you start to feel a certain thing, right? When you feel anxious or when you start to have an obsession, and that obsession creates distress or urge or anxiety. Humans don't like to feel uncomfortable, right? Like there's no glory in feeling pain for the sake of pain. We prefer not to feel it. And so there are things we do to try to get more comfortable. And of course, in the example of OCD, it would typically be rituals or avoidance to try to prevent the triggering of the obsession in the first place. What we look at is the function of those behaviors. So I have this thought, this feeling, this internal experience that I don't particularly want to have. And so I engage in some behavior or an avoidance of some behavior, a lack of a behavior. The way I like to talk about it, and I talk about this in the book, is it works or we wouldn't do it. Like everything we choose to do gets us something, right? So I'll give a couple examples. Like everyone can relate to procrastination. I don't know anyone on the planet who hasn't procrastinated a time or two, right?
Yeah.
But yet we all rationally know procrastination is bad, right? It's not healthy. I'm making air quotes. Think about the last time you chose to procrastinate. You had some aversive task, something you didn't feel like doing, and you give yourself permission to put it off until tomorrow or next week. And in that moment that you're like, oh, I'll just do it later, what do you get?
Relief.
Exactly, right? You feel better in the moment. So it works or we wouldn't do it, but it works in the short term. And so, yes, you get relief, you feel better, you don't have to deal with it, you've let yourself off the hook, but now, of course, tomorrow you have the same amount to do and less time to do it. Yep. So now whatever the aversive thing was in the beginning, the feelings you had about this task, typically now they're amplified. In ACT, that's a big piece of what we're looking at is what is the function of behavior? When you feel a certain way, what do you do? And when you do that, what does it get you? What is the purpose of that behavior? In other words, what is its function? And how does this show up across different settings, situations, contexts? In many ways, like diagnosis is irrelevant. Now, we still, will assess and diagnose because it provides a common language for providers and it helps us, have some relative understanding of what someone's struggling with. But in reality, we're just sitting with this person in front of us and trying to understand what are the internal experiences you're struggling with? How do you respond to those? How's that working for you? That's the function. But then what's the cost? How is it not working for you? So in the case of OCD, the rituals, the compulsions, they work, air quotes, right? They get the person relief, even if it's just very short-term relief, even if it wears off very quickly, even if in the beginning of OCD, the rituals worked much better and now they're not working so well anymore. But they still work to a degree in the short term. But the cost, there's many different costs, right? It can be time. I mean, overall, it can end up interfering with work and school and relationships and any number of different things. Yeah. And so what ACT is really looking at is not solving the anxiety or the OCD or the depression, sadness, whatever guilt, whatever feeling someone is coming in with. ACT isn't aimed at fixing that. What we're looking at is like, maybe the pain isn't the problem. It's uncomfortable. Yes, of course. But pain is also part of being a human being. Mm-hmm. And what seems to really get us stuck isn't the pain itself. It's all the stuff we're doing to try to avoid the pain. That dread I feel about doing that aversive task isn't the problem. It's the procrastination that's actually making things worse. ACT is all about, so one of the ways it's different from cognitive behavioral therapy, which people tend to be more familiar with, CBT is aimed at really changing the content of thoughts and feelings, et cetera. With ACT, we're changing our relationship to those experiences. Okay. So I referred in the very beginning, when we were asking about the three amigos, we're trying to suggest that maybe these internal experiences don't need to be our enemy and that we can change the way that we relate to them so that we can have a full and meaningful and vital life. So there are 6 core processes with ACT, and we can go through those if you would like to and you think that would be helpful. But one of them is committed action, and this is attached to values. So values is the person I want to be, what I want to stand for, the qualities I bring to the things that I'm doing, or what I call in the book, the me I want to be. The committed action is the steps I'm actually taking to practice or enact or embody those values. And in committed action, you see a lot of the same kinds of skills that you might see across different kinds of therapies. You might see problem solving, you might see communication training. And this is where the principles of ERP are also used. So I think there's a misconception out there among some people that ACT does not include exposure, and that's absolutely false. Anyone who is doing ACT with anxiety or a phobic issue or OCD is doing exposure. Where it's different is in 2 places. One is that we're not really focusing on habituation. So we're not necessarily asking for a SUDS rating. Sometimes we still do, just as a point of data. So SUDS, the subjective units of distress score. But we're less interested in the anxiety going down, or the urge or the distress going away. And the other is that when exposure is done in the context of ACT, we're always focusing on values. So it's not just exposure for the sake of exposure. It's, why does this matter in your life? You know, if you were able to confront these difficult internal experiences in a different way, if you were able to have obsessions and anxiety and urges and not engage in rituals, how does this move you in the direction of being the person you want to be and having the life that you want? But we're still doing exposure when we're doing ACT. So I want to make sure that that's clear. And
so, Jill, is it possible to give us what might be a typical case for you and how you might step through that for OCD?
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the things about ACT is that there's no one right place to start. So it's not, okay, first we talk about acceptance and next we talk about values. You start based on your clinical judgment about the person that is sitting across from you in therapy and what sort of feels like the best place that's going to, really sort of land. So I can talk about a quote unquote, typical case, but in some way, where we start and where we go isn't necessarily typical. It's pretty flexible, right? Because the whole point is flexibility. But what I often do start with is creative hopelessness. And this is what we've already talked a little bit about. This is, I want to know what are the internal experiences you're having that are causing you trouble? What are you doing in response? How is that working for you? What's the function? And what is the cost? And the goal of that, and typically I take a whole session to really unpack that. And the goal of that is to help them see at the end where I'll say, okay, looking at all of this, and you can do this in a conversation or with a worksheet or on a whiteboard, whatever your personal style is as a therapist is fine. And at the end of that, I'll say, so what does this tell you? What does your experience tell you? And a big part of ACT is I'm not the expert telling you the way things are. You're the expert on your own experience. And what we want to do is get away from judgments and assumptions and rules and this cognitive language-based thinking and really rely on direct experience to have a greater understanding. So what does your experience tell you? And people will be able to say, right, okay, all this stuff I'm doing when I feel bad, works kind of sort of in the short term, but in the long term, it's making things worse. It's called creative hopelessness because we don't want a person to have an overall hopelessness. We want them to feel hopeless about all the stuff they're doing. I want a client who has OCD to recognize that ritualizing is like a hopeless way to try to rid yourself of anxiety or OCD. And from there, we build the hope of maybe there's a different way. Maybe there's a better way. And that's where the acceptance and commitment therapy comes in. And so then we really practice, we define what acceptance and willingness are, which is simply to make space for something that's already here anyway. And when we're talking about acceptance, we mean of internal experiences, thoughts, feelings, emotions, urges, to make space for something that's already here anyway, because when you try to avoid it, you get more stuck. And so we build on this idea of maybe you can relate to these internal experiences, these obsessions, this anxiety in a different way in the service of moving forward with your life and being the me you want to be, the values. So that's actually, I'll give you a metaphor that I like that I use with quite a few people, including OCD people, because I think people can really relate to this. I think about it as sort of like a detonator and a bomb. And I like detonator because everyone knows, like, if you say, oh, it pushes my buttons, that's a metaphor that everyone understands in English language. And so the idea is that there's all sorts of things that push our detonators, right? There's all sorts of triggers that trigger obsessions. And typically, the detonator gets pushed and the bomb goes off. And that's the ritual. That's the automatic reaction that happens. And the space between those two things is non-existent. And what we want to do is create more space between the detonator getting pushed and the bomb going off. And the way to create space is through mindfulness. This is one of the 6 core processes of ACT. It's called present moment awareness in ACT. But it's just learning how to, John Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, to the present, non-judgmentally. And so some people say, oh my God, I'm hyper aware of my obsessions, my anxiety. Why would I want to pay more attention? But what we want to pay attention to that when that urge shows up. If you're not aware of what's happening on the inside, then you're going to react. The bomb's just going to go off. And so we want to create space through present moment awareness. And then in that space is where we dismantle the bomb. And the way we dismantle the bomb is with some of the other core processes of ACT. One is acceptance and willingness. So making space for the anxiety, the obsessions, the urges, and not doing anything to push it away, avoid it. One is defusion. And this is not diffusion. It's confusing with a bomb metaphor, but defusion. So fusion is really getting hooked by your thinking. Like you hear your thoughts and you believe that they are truth with a capital T, and you just do whatever they tell you to do. Right? So in the case of OCD, if your thought is saying, oh, I had a client once who every time she heard a siren, her mind would tell her that she had to pray or the person who was being rescued by the ambulance was going to die. And this became a ritual. And certainly, obsessions are thoughts. We believe them. If your obsessions tell you, you better not drive a car with your partner because you might crash it into a wall, or you better avoid sharp objects because you might, harm this person that you care about, this feels really scary. And there's a getting hooked by those thoughts, right? Like really getting, I think it's Rick Hansen talks about Velcro versus Teflon. Getting hooked by those thoughts is like the thoughts are like Velcro, like this sticky Velcro. What defusion is kind of observing those thoughts dispassionately from a distance, letting them like slip through a Teflon pan. And so again, this is a way we're changing a relationship to a thought. So we can make space for anxiety and urges. We can observe our thoughts without taking them as literal truths. And all of that is in the service of doing what is meaningful to us, being the person we want to be, living the life that we want. And there's a couple other elements in there too, but
it's a subject that I'm sure you could probably talk all day on it. It's a lot. It's very complex, and so I appreciate. I wish we had more time because we could go into it deeper. But it did give a good overview of what ACT is about and how you use it. So I very much appreciate that. Is there any other message that you'd want to get out right now to my audience that you'd want to leave with, I guess?
Ooh, I love that question. I guess I would want to encourage people to seek out ACT resources. There's lots of right ways to get help and to grow and improve as a human. This is one of the ways, and I feel like in my 47 years, I've tried lots of different ways myself and as a psychologist. And this is one that when I found it, it just really clicked for me. I think the other thing I would want to say really about values and pain is that they're like two sides of the same coin. You can't not feel anxiety and care about things, right? Like I joke in the book about how the stuff that's keeping you up at night is not worrying about whether Netflix is going to go out of business, right? You might love binge watching The Tiger King, but you're not worrying about it at night. You're worrying about the people you love, or your career, or your animals, or your health or well-being. And so as long as you approach the things that really matter to you, there's going to be anxiety. And with OCD, typically people's obsessions are directly connected to what matter most to them, right? Things that are deeply important in their heart. Our instinct is to turn away from pain, when in reality, the pain is a neon arrow pointing at what we care about, and we really should be moving toward it. And ACT is a therapy that teaches that lesson and teaches you how to do that. And since I've been living ACT in my own life, and it's been nearly 20 years now, and it's taken a long time, I would say, to feel like it really clicked, and I still fail all the time, I would say that I'm probably more anxious. People might not like this, but I'm probably more anxious than I've ever been, because I'm living a really big life. I'm taking risks. I'm doing things that 20 years ago, I never in a million years would have said yes to. So it's not just about, relieving OCD or quote unquote curing some mental health issue. It's really about living a big, bold, beautiful life, even with the anxiety that may bring.
That's a wonderful message. It was very good. So thank you for that. And lastly, I guess, is to let the audience know is some of the best ways to find out about you, to get a hold of you or find out about you.
Sure. So I have a website that's just my name, jillstoddard.com. And I have a blog where I write predominantly ACT-focused kinds of topics, and you can find that there. I'm everywhere on social media. So my Instagram is Jill A. Stoddard. Twitter is Jill_Stoddard. My Facebook author page is Jill Stoddard, PhD. And my LinkedIn page is Jill Stoddard, PhD. So none of them are the same. And then I have a clinic, a stress and anxiety management clinic, an OCD clinic in San Diego. And that website is csamsandiego.com. So CSAM, like Center for Stress and Anxiety Management, sandiego.com.
And I'll remind the audience that I will have all of those up on the invisiblewheelchair.com website and the familyocd.com website, so that you'll be able to find out more about this wonderful person and all her great work that she's doing, and her wonderful book, Be Mighty. What's the full title? You can give that one, I'm sure.
It's Be Mighty, A Woman's Guide to Liberation from Anxiety, Worry, and Stress Using Mindfulness and Acceptance.
They were able to fit all that on the book, huh? They
were. And actually right now, if people order from my jillstoddard.com website, I'm giving away a free journal with every book that's ordered.
All right.
Journal.
I'll have to put that up there also. And I believe it's in the bio too. That it's mentioned in the bio with the full name and all that too. So, well, Jill, it has been
I'll give you one more thing. Sorry, let me give you one more thing. I can't believe I forgot this. It's one of my favorite things that I do, but I also co-host a podcast called Psychologists Off the Clock. We do many, many different psychological topics and have had incredible guests, and a number of our guests focus on ACT topics and self-compassion and mindfulness. So if listeners are interested in learning more, that's a great place to go.
Well, they will definitely find out about that one too. So again, Jill, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you and get to meet you. This is our first time we've met, so it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
That's right. You too, Don. Thank you so much for having me.
This concludes this podcast. We hope you will subscribe if you haven't already. Remember, we would love your comments, or if you have a story to tell, we want to put it up on the podcast. Simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com to do that. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest, we love guests. So simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com and contact us from there. Gina and I are here to help you or your family get to a better place naturally. Simply visit focusedhealthyfamily.com for more information. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep tapping and focusing forward for a better way.